Welcome, everybody, to our live The Art of Advocacy show tonight. And if you're a parent and you've ever heard from a teacher, well, you know, your son or daughter really is functioning at a much lower level than the general education students. So we really don't suggest that your child be included in general education classes at this time. Well, if that's something that you've been hearing at IEP meetings, you're in the right place tonight, because tonight we're lucky to have a special guest with us. Nicole Eridix from the inclusion class is going to be joining us, and she has specific examples of modifications that our students can be using so they will be successful learning next to their peers in the regular classrooms. If you are new to the show, you might not know who I am. I'm Charmaine Tanner. I'm a parent, a retired teacher, an advocate, and also author of the #1 best-selling book, The Art of Advocacy, A Parent's Guide to a Collaborative IEP Process. So I want to welcome in Nicole. Like I said, I think we're really privileged. Nicole is also a parent and a teacher and an inclusions expert. So when I was thinking about guests for this month, I knew Nicole would be one of those people. I was lucky a while ago, I was on her podcast and I talked about IEP meetings with less drama. So it's fun now to be back connected through technology, at least with Nicole. So welcome this evening, Nicole.
Hello, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I know people are really looking forward to this. So as you're listening to us, if you have the people that are viewing, if you have any questions or comments, type them in the box right there on Facebook. And I'll be looking every once in a while on my phone and passing those questions on to Nicole. So thanks for being here again. I thought it would be good, even though tonight we're talking about modifications, for maybe Nicole to spend just a couple minutes to talk about what the difference between accommodations and modifications are.
Yes, I think that's a great place to start, Charmaine. It's really important for not just educators, but parents to also know the difference between the two. They frequently get confused for one another. So I think in order to understand what we're talking about tonight, it's great to have a baseline and understand the difference. So, and I notice that you have my chart here up on your screen for your audience to see. And I just want to backtrack a bit and say that, educators already do a wonderful job of providing great quality curriculum to their students. And as we know more, we do better. We are, as educators, more focused on research-based instruction, which gives students, different types of learners, access to curriculum. Some parents might have heard of terms such as universal design for learning or differentiation. And those are strategies that teachers use in the classroom every day to help students access the curriculum. However, there are cases when some students need a little bit more support. And in those cases, the teacher will bring in the support team in the school, the resource team in the school, and together we'll make a decision as to whether or not the student requires support learning the material or access to the material. And that's the big difference between accommodations and modifications. Now, accommodations typically are what we call pathways to learning. So basically, the student is already capable of learning grade level material. They may require a little bit of support to solidify that learning process. So for example, I like to use the situation where a student who may not be able to see the whiteboard from where they're sitting. their vision is not as strong. And so that doesn't take away from their ability to learn, their capability to learn. But what we can do to support that learning and to make it even greater and to make that student even more successful is to give them a pair of eyeglasses so that they can see the whiteboard clear and see the material. So accommodations such as that, really, the learning outcomes are the exact same for every student, including that child. However, we're just giving them tools to, like I said, facilitate the learning, to access it, and to be able to be more successful, solidify that learning process. And another term that we often hear in education is accommodations level the playing field. So they make everybody has that ability to learn the same content. Now, in a situation where we have a student who just is not quite working at the level that we would expect of a student at that age and developmental ability, what we do then is, with the support of the special education teacher, the resource team, the parents, they come together and decide, you know what, we think this student is not quite working where they should be at this point. So what we're going to do is, rather than expect the same learning outcomes of that student, because we really want students to be successful in school, we want them to be able to learn at their ability level. We don't want to keep throwing content at them that they're just not, it's too overwhelming. So we want to meet students where they are at. And in that situation, when we have entirely different learning outcomes and expectations of a student, what we do is we modify the curriculum. So we don't want to necessarily remove the child from the class or from their typically developing peers. We don't want to have them in a self-contained room. If they are still capable in terms of health and physical ability, if they are still capable of being in the classroom, then that's where we want them. And by the classroom, I mean the general education classroom. And we still want them learning. So we modify the curriculum so that the student can have access, can have the opportunity to learn from a curriculum that has been modified and changed from what the rest of the students are receiving. And that is a very formal process. There's an individual education plan involved. There's meetings involved with parents and teachers, and usually extra support personnel in the district. Speech language pathologists can sometimes be called in to help create that modified and support that modified program. And so, as I mentioned, the outcomes are very different for a child who's on a modified program, and therefore the way that they demonstrate their learning is evaluated a little bit differently. Grading is generally different, but the bottom line is that the similarity between the accommodations and modifications is that in both situations, the student is able to have exposure to and participate in the curriculum. And that's the idea of the modification. So the modification is a gateway to that curriculum, really. It's allowing that child to have the same experiences and the same opportunities of the other students in his or her grade level.
Right, and that is so important, because I know my son Dylan, who is an adult now, but when he was in school, he needed sometimes accommodations, but often he needed modifications. But he was successfully included all through school, and audited classes in college. So I think there are rich opportunities for our students. And like you said, especially when teachers use that framework of universal design for learning, that really opens the doors. And the other thing I found as a teacher is when I would, do some kind of modification or an accommodation for a student, there would be so many other kids in my class that benefited from that. It was like, why haven't I been teaching that way all, from the beginning? So I think it makes us better teachers when we have to think outside of that, box. And certainly it gives the students the chance to show their strengths and be able to, be friends and learners and right next to their peers in the classroom. So I just really love when we can get those kinds of opportunities going. And one of the things that I wanted to share, which I thought was kind of interesting when I was looking at Brooks Publishing, they had an article there on the Inclusion Lab about examples of worst modifications. And I took some of them. One is, I'll go ahead and read it to our viewers. It says, the 7th grade class is doing math, but one student is using Sesame Street blocks to work on counting. So here it is, a 7th grader. So I don't know, Nicole, if you want to address these as we go through each one, or we can just kind of globally look at them. But that idea of doing totally separate work, I mean, it's still math, but that's certainly not an example of a good modification we would want people to use.
Yeah, and, I guess, so for me, of course, I'm a little biased. When I talk modifications, I talk about a student receiving modified work in a classroom with typically developing peers, same age peers. So we would call that an inclusive class. Although students do receive modifications in their special education classrooms as well. However, what we are providing for those students in terms of content and curriculum has to be age appropriate and curriculum appropriate. So the fact that a student in 7th grade class is using Sesame Street blocks to work on counting, well, using the blocks isn't necessarily a negative, and using Sesame Street may not necessarily be a negative if that's what the student is interested in. However, we do need to be aware that perhaps the student is not interested in Sesame Street and can use, the blocks in a variety of ways to work on the counting. So we could, there's all sorts of apps that we can use. There's all sorts of other different manipulatives other than blocks that kids can use to work on a modification. So I think in that scenario, depending on now of course I'm assuming that counting is the learning goal for that student. Now, of course, if it isn't, then that's an even worse modification. But yeah, we need to make those modifications really appropriate to the age and the interest of the student.
Right. So that would be one, it's almost like, as parents, we can have a checklist that maybe helps us, and ask ourselves questions. And so this question would be, is this age appropriate for my son or daughter to be doing in the classroom? And that would be, like I said, kind of one of those big main factors that we want to look at when we're choosing modifications is the age appropriateness. Now, the next example here of a worst modification is the classroom is arranged with desks to groups of 5, but one student is seated in a group with only 2 desks, one for him and one for his assistant. So do you want to speak to that one?
Yeah, and this is more of also a more of an inclusion issue as well, because is that student now I understand that some students do need some really intense, hand over hand type support from the paraeducator. However, is the student seated where it's most appropriate for the student to learn the content and to interact with peers? Because learning and classroom experiences aren't just about academics. It's about the social emotional development of a child as well. And you also want to provide the student with equal opportunities and equal experiences as their peers. Now, if they're seated off to the side in the back of the classroom, they're not, near their friends, they're not chatting, they're not interacting, they're not learning from one another, then that becomes an issue. And they almost become an island unto themselves. And that's not an ideal learning situation, for most kids. I mean, obviously we need to check, that individual child's needs. I mean, perhaps there's some sensory issues involved, but yeah, I think there's other ways to do that. We can do better with those types of seating arrangements.
Right, right. And like you said, I think as we all learn more, we do more and we can do better. So what I'm hoping to do with these kind of non-examples of modifications is to help parents, like if this is happening in their child's classroom, what would be something that they could suggest that the teacher try instead. So I'm really appreciating your insights. We have a couple more here. This one is, during silent reading, the speech language pathologist takes one student to the back of the classroom to work on articulation.
Right. And again, first of all, is this the best time for the speech language pathologist to work with the student? Is there another time in the day that the student can be, working with that sort of one-on-one intense instruction or instructor? So we need to, again, look at what are the students' learning outcomes, how can we best meet them within the framework, within the day that the other students are experiencing as well. There are some times in the day when it just, may not be the best to have that student pulled aside. I mean, would the student would there be more benefits to the student reading with his or her peers? So you need to look at timing in this issue.
Right.
And also, because, in real life, I mean, there are support personnel that do come to the classroom, and that is the premise of inclusion and inclusive classrooms, where services are brought to the child. The child isn't taken out for services. There is a time and place for that, but is it really, are they benefiting more from having the speech language pathologist instruct them, or would they benefit more from reading with their peers? So I think that's a big issue in that situation.
Right, right. So I've also been stalking your website, the inclusive classroom, or the inclusive class, I'm sorry. And I know you had written a blog on there about modifications. So we have some examples here that we can show our viewers. And if you want to explain this math modification.
Yeah. So for me, when we give students modifications or modified work, it's really important for me to try or give the student access to grade level curriculum and content as much as possible. Of course, assuming that it's appropriate for the student and it's something that they are capable or interested in or, able to understand. So in this situation here, in this example, what it demonstrates is a grade level activity, so math, and obviously you see skills on there that are grade appropriate. However, in this situation, there would be, so for example, there's a student who is on a modified program and is still learning number concepts such as adding and subtracting. Well, rather than giving them an entirely different activity to do, which is time consuming on the teacher's behalf, I'm not going to lie.
That's right.
So that, rather than creating an entire different program for that student, the teacher can use materials that she's already giving to the class to provide, the appropriate instruction that the student on the modified program needs. So in this situation, the teacher has pointed the arrow at the numbers on the paper and said, you know what? There are a ton of numbers on this page. There is no reason why you can't add up those numbers just because the kids are maybe using those numbers in fractions or working with those numbers in graphs or, reading word problems using those numbers. There's no reason why you can't learn to add with those numbers. And that's an excellent opportunity for the student to receive and have, the same exposure to this type of high level content, because that's really what it is too. We don't want to expect the minimum from our students on modified programs. We want to have high expectations of them and give them access to quality curriculum. And so this is an example of how you can do this using work from, a grade level classroom activity.
And I think what else, excuse me, that I think of when I look at, this is a typical worksheet that the other students in the classroom are going to have. And by using that same identical worksheet, but changing the tasks that the student has to do, instead of solving each one of those problems, there may be just identifying numerals or, adding up some of the numerals and the digits. What I've seen is, especially as students get older, they hate to have a worksheet that looks entirely different than everybody else in the classroom. So I just love the way that you've come up with ideas of using that same worksheet, but having it be at a level that's challenging for that student on an IEP.
Yeah, I think that is so important, is recognizing that, just because they're adding numbers does not mean that they need to have, a preschool worksheet that has a dog and a duck on it. They can learn to work with numbers on more age appropriate or using more age appropriate materials. So we need to be really cognizant of the types of materials we're giving the student to learn with.
Right. And here is another math example from your blog post.
Yeah. And this is, again, the teacher has taken the activities on the page and made them more appropriate for the student. Now, of course, before the teacher modifies this page, the teacher knows what the student's learning outcomes are, the learning expectations are. It's not just a random, I'm going to get them to add these two numbers because that's the easiest thing for me to modify on this page. No, it's about making sure you're aligned with their individual education plan and making those goals something that the student is learning in a modified way. So in this case, we've got the student again working with number concepts, multiplying, adding. Things have been simplified, broken down. You can see up there in the left-hand box at the top, rather than, this is obviously a word problem, but the teacher has turned it into a numerical problem. And down at, right underneath that, the teacher has actually written out the problem itself. So, she's removed that extra step of trying to create that, what numbers am I going to use and how am I going to use them in the first place? And again, you can see down at the bottom there, the teacher has actually written out for the student to understand the problem there. So it's really about, when I think of modifying work, it's about breaking it down, taking things apart, and making it or turning it into something that the student who is working with it can understand. It's not necessarily giving them an entirely different activity, but an activity that is, I usually think of it, 2, 3, or 4 grade levels. Think of it in terms of an activity that's 2 or 3 grade levels below of what you're giving.
Right. And I also wanted to share this reading example that you have on your blog post.
Yeah, this one is, obviously a text or a novel excerpt from probably a grade 3 or 4 class, and the student that is on the modified program receives a simplified version of this where, and I've seen this done with pictures, so like peck symbols, sorry.
Uh-huh.
And I've also seen it done with text. So depending again on what level your student is working at, you can just take, print out the story in a version that the student can understand, and just basically cover up the text that's already there. And that way, the student still has the same book that everybody else does, still talking about the same story, the same big ideas, but it's more suited to that student's reading level. Um, and once again, the student is not reading something totally different than the rest of the class. They
Right.
can also, talk about the same ideas and concepts in the story. And this is a popular, I've seen entirely separate books made, like separate versions made and laminated. And then I've also seen instances where the simplified version is just basically taped right on top. So
Right. And yeah, like you said, I've seen teachers do that where, they still use the same book, the same novel, but, somehow insert, adaptive text in it. I think the other thing is keep making sure the illustrations are there if that novel has the illustrations, and, sometimes highlighting the caption under it, but,
mm-hmm.
I think what we see with our students is that they can learn additional concepts and, be engaged in literacy like the other students are. And then when they have oral discussion time or other activities around that novel, they have that, information to hook onto, and they've been exposed to that. So it makes for, upcoming activities that they're going to do to follow up with the novel easier for that student to be a part of also.
Exactly. And, this class has a common language, which is really important to, that sense of belonging that students have, every student has on some level. It gives the students, once again, a common experience. I know I keep saying that over and over again, but I truly believe that, inclusion is more than just providing them with similar academic experiences.
Oh, exactly.
So, yeah.
Here is a spelling example, which
Mm-hmm.
is a great way to make a modified spelling list.
Yeah, I get asked about spelling a lot because it's just one of those, the spelling list is something that every grade sees. And sometimes a teacher doesn't know how to take that grade level spelling list and make it accessible to a student who's on, a totally different, a modified spelling program, who's learning words that are at a different level. But and I've had a lot of success with this strategy. I've had other strategies that I've used around the spelling list, but this one is probably the most simplest. That in this case, the student is looks like still learning to identify letters of the alphabet, and the teacher simply is asking, have a look on this paper full of words and find the letter A and just cross it out. Or circle the A or underline it, or, and then of course, depending on the child's ability level, maybe the child is learning more than just the letter. Maybe the child is learning really, 3-letter simple words like cat and hat. Well, have the student go through the list and see if they can find those words inside these larger ones. And that's something that is also quite a popular strategy too, is picking out the smaller words inside the larger ones.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. And so, like you said, you can, I think sometimes, teachers might be reluctant to include a student that's working at a much different level than the other students in the classroom. But I think what they can realize, when they have appropriate modifications, is that you can work on those IEP goals in the general ed classroom. You don't have to be pulled out to work on your math, reading, or spelling instruction, but it can be, embedded right there in the general ed classroom.
Exactly. And that is really the whole idea of these modifications that we're talking about tonight. It's not about making extra work for everybody. It's not about providing an entirely separate program for the student. It's about taking what you have and changing it and modifying it to suit all the different levels in your class. Because you know what? Not every class, I can't even think of a class that I've had in 20 odd years of teaching where every child is at the exact same level.
Right.
So you're still, teachers are still changing and providing accessible materials to students. This is just taking it one extra step and saying, you know what, we really do need to pay attention to what we're giving this particular student. And it doesn't need to be something that's totally different and separate. And of course, too, just going quickly back to the the modified books, sorry. You can just look online. I mean, I think I threw up a link on my Facebook page a couple days ago, and it has modified books, like, for example, Pride and Prejudice in a modified version with symbols. And, you can just, and Charmaine, I can give you that link if you want to repost it for your listeners. But so the teacher doesn't even need to doesn't need to print out those pictures or create that simplified version. It's already there online. So makes it a lot easier.
Right. And I think that's the thing, is sometimes just there's so much available, and for us to know the right places to go to find the resources. And before I forget, I also wanted Nicole to be able to talk about a new book that she's working on. And so, Nicole, if you can give us a sneak peek about what we can expect with your new book.
Yes, I'm so excited. Thank you for asking about it. I'm in the process of having a book published with Brooks Publishing, and I've written a book on various modification strategies. So the strategies that you saw here tonight are kind of a sneak peek at some of the strategies that I'm putting in the book, and there's about 40 of them all together. And it's there's strategies that any teacher or parent can refer to, basically, go through and say, oh yeah, I can use this strategy with language arts. I can use this modification strategy with math. I can use this with science. So yeah, I'm really excited about it, and it should be hopefully out on shelves in the fall. And I don't really have a title set in stone yet, but it's basically, modifications to include all learners in your classroom, including those who are working below grade level. So
I think that'll be great. If you go over to Nicole's website, The Inclusive Class, I'm sure she'll be giving us updates in the next few months. And I also will be publicizing that, because I really am a fan of Nicole's work. I think she has a very practical way of doing modifications, but, making sure that students are honored, respected with what we give them in classrooms, and have that sense of belonging so they can be successful and feel good about themselves. And so their peers can see that, yes, they've got strengths too, and they are competent, and they can be learners also. So it just makes such a huge difference with what we provide for our kids in classrooms.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we include others in our family life, in our community, in our, places of religious conviction. I mean, people are included in real life every day. Why not school? So.
Right. I had one more example from your blog post, and this was a modified 8th grade science assignment.
Yeah, so this is an example of really just simplifying an activity that's already in the textbook. Obviously, in this particular modified assignment, the teacher has recreated the assignment, just taken the chart there on the left side that the students are to fill out and really broken it down into very simple yes/no questions, on a different sheet, obviously, but still the same concepts that are being provided to the students. So this
Right.
is, yeah, something that's just, and I mentioned that before, really modifications are just taking the content, breaking it down, simplifying it, providing an alternate way for the student to do it, to work with it. So, yeah.
Right. So I think, what I would love to have is for people to be able to be more familiar with your work. I know you have your website, which is the Inclusive Class. So I'm hoping that people will visit there. And you also have a Facebook page under the same name, right?
Yes. And actually, I don't know if you've seen Pinterest yet, but I've got numerous boards on ways to include students in different areas of the curriculum, language arts, reading, science. So Pinterest is a very popular place to go that people who follow my page and who follow my website, they are often over on Pinterest as well. I find a ton of stuff over there, and Twitter. I'm
Oh,
also
so yeah, because I totally forgot about all the boards that you have on Pinterest. So if you're watching this live or you're watching the replay and you are one of those Pinterest fans, I'll go ahead and put that link in our comment box. So at the end of the video, you can check that Pinterest board out. And then what about Twitter? How would they get a hold of you on Twitter?
Yeah, well, with Twitter, I'm at inclusive_class, and you can just follow me on Twitter. And, I think I generally give the same information that I do on Twitter as on Facebook, but what I do on Twitter is I like to retweet, or like to, provide information from other people. So I
Right.
like to, yeah, follow other people and retweet their information. So you can really just go down that rabbit hole of information.
I know but it's fun. I mean, and I really like Pinterest for kind of my last of the evening computer work where it's just kind of nice. It's almost like eye candy. And I especially like your Pinterest boards because they're just real visual, colorful. They've got great, practical tips and strategies. So
Yeah.
I encourage people to go there. And then I also wanted to mention the Inclusion Lab from Brooks Publishing, and I know you've had some posts there that you've written for them.
Yes. Over at the Inclusion Lab, it's full of information for teachers and parents on how to include students with disabilities in the general education class. There's a whole post on that answers more questions on accommodations and modifications. I know that I've done one other one and I can't think of the title right now, but there's so many great posts over there. And then of course links to their books, their wonderful materials, their resources that you can purchase. It's an excellent resource. It's definitely one of my go-to resources and one that I recommend for teachers and parents.
Right, right. Well, I appreciate you taking your time out tonight, Nicole. I know the stress of trying to get your book published as far as getting all those last minute edits and all the details that comes with writing a book. So I just am honored that you chose to spend some time with us tonight.
Thank you.
The people watching have friends that would love to see this video, tell them that it will remain up on my Facebook site, my Facebook page. I also will upload it to my YouTube channel because on Facebook, after a while, when I post new things, the videos kind of get further and further down. So sometimes it's just easier to go to my YouTube channel, which is under my business name, Collaborative Special Education Advocacy, and see my videos there. And Nicole, when I upload that to YouTube, I can give you the link for that too, so you could put that on your Facebook page for your fans to go back and watch.
Would love to. And I admire your work too, Charmaine, and thank you so much for, inviting me on and having me here this evening, despite the dinging in the background of my, I apologize for that. They're not going away.
You're a popular woman. What can we say?
Thank you for having me. It's been delightful, and I'm so thankful for the opportunity to share this information with more people.
Great. But thank you. And to everybody on live with us tonight, we'll be back next Thursday at 7 o'clock Mountain Time, and I'll be doing a show about accommodations for students. So make sure you like the Facebook page that you're on now, and you'll get notifications. But basically, every Thursday evening at 7 o'clock, we have a Facebook Live show. So thank everybody for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your week.